loud because I got audio to share with you today. I had it last week too, but we didn't get to it. So we should be able to get to it today. And yeah, hopefully we'll have no more technical difficulties that I've been having all morning. And I'm still a little, had to chase a bobcat away from our chickens this morning. So yeah, no bear this time, but bobcat. So anyway, last week we were talking about Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and we talked about some interesting distinctives about the Vulgate that still impact us today. One, that it was a revision, especially in the New Testament. It was a revision of other Latin translations that were out. It was not a virgin work, as it were. Jerome distinguished between formal and functional translations, preferring the latter. He argues for functional translations by saying a literal translation from one language to another obscures the sense. And John Mead puts the Latin Vulgate on the functional side, right about here. All right, and this would be about the spot where our NIV sits. And then we've got the fact that Jerome gave Hebrew priority over the Septuagint, and that was a big deal. This was a big deal because, as we talked about already, just about every single person, unless you were reading the Syriac translation or the Greek and Hebrew directly, you were reading from the Septuagint. And so Jerome changing this to going back to the Hebrew was a big deal, and it caused a lot of controversy. And particularly the controversy was risen between these two giants, Jerome and Augustine, who we've talked about quite a bit. And Augustine, he was going to argue from a church tradition standpoint that traditionally the church had been using the Septuagint, and the church had received the Septuagint. And because the traditional received text, if you will, of the church at this time, both in the Eastern Empire, the Eastern churches and the Western churches were using the Septuagint. So again, the only ones who weren't were the Syriac ones. They were using the Hebrew in their Syriac translation. Coptic churches were also using a translation from the Septuagint. So most everyone was using the Septuagint as the text that they had received. And so Jerome argues that he wants to go back to the fountains of truth. He doesn't want to translate from a translation. He wants to translate directly from the original languages. And so Augustine writes him a letter. And in his letter, we're not going to go through all of the letter again, but we'll highlight a couple of points. One, he wants footnotes. He wants to see the footnotes where Jerome departs from the Septuagint in order to follow the Masoretic text, and he wants footnotes to explain why. Then he says that the Septuagint translators were well-versed in both the Greek and Hebrew in their day, that their scholarship was excellent, and that there was no reason not to trust them on a particular translation that they chose. And then he further bolsters this point, and he says, if something was obscure, there would be no better set of translators to interpret what the obscurity was in Hebrew than the Septuagint translators, so we should follow them. And if it was plain, then there was nothing Jerome could add to it. And that was his argument. If it was easy to understand, what could you contribute? It's already been taken care of. And that was in 393. Jerome does not reply. And so Augustine writes one more letter. And then in 403, 10 years later, Augustine sends, what's his name? Cyprian. He sends Cyprian, someone Augustine apparently had led to the Lord or was discipling. He sends Cyprian, a deacon in his church, with a letter to Jerome requesting that he respond to his previous letters. And he suggests that maybe Jerome never got the letters. So he sent Cyprian with copies of his original letters so that he would respond. And he says, I expect a response. And Cyprian's not going to leave without a response. And so he's putting the pressure on Jerome to respond. in his letters, he's talking about one of the things he brings up is that he thinks Jerome is mistaken to go back to the Hebrew. He says that there's not enough Hebrew speakers to arbitrate if Jerome got a translation wrong. And then he says he believes Jerome got a translation wrong in the book of Jonah, and that this inaccurate translation, according to Augustine, almost caused a pastor to lose his ability to pastor a church, that he was about to get fired for this translation error, that the whole church was in an uproar, and that this pastor went to a nearby Jewish community to ask whether or not Jerome translated this Hebrew word correctly. And the Jewish community confirmed Augustine's suspicion that the word was translated incorrectly. And so he wants Jerome to go back to the Septuagint, not to the Hebrew. And so we talked about that. All right. And then Jerome finally responds, because he's got a man standing in front of him and says, I'm not leaving until I get a response. So Jerome responds. So Jerome starts by talking about the footnotes, the issues of the footnotes. And he says, what you have in your hands is a translation of the Septuagint. That is not a translation of the Hebrew, because the practice that you're referring to of the footnotes that I put in there, I only did that on my Septuagint translation. My Hebrew one doesn't have that. And the asterisks and the footnotes that you're seeing, they aren't where I departed from the Hebrew. They're where the Septuagint departs from the Hebrew. And the obelisks, because he used both asterisks and obelisks, the asterisks and the obelisks, the other one was where the Septuagint departs from itself. In other words, we have more than one Septuagint manuscript. We've got one from Origen. We've got one from Theodotion. We've got one from Aquila. We've got all these different Septuagint translations. And the base text Septuagint that he's using, he marks with an obelisk or an asterisk, I forget which one's which, to demonstrate that the Septuagints have disagreement among each other. And then he says to Augustine, I'm surprised you don't recognize a Septuagint translation when you have one. It's sitting in your lap. It's a Septuagint translation. It is what you're asking for. And if you want to follow the Septuagint exactly, don't read anything after the asterisk. That's what he says. He says after the asterisk, don't read the rest of it, because those are additions added by the other Septuagint translators. And then he goes on to say, let's see, is there anything else I want to add? No, that's it. Then he goes on to say that the word that I supposedly mistranslated, this part just gets me because it's so true the way he handles it. He says, you didn't tell me what the word was. You just inferred that there was a word that was mistranslated, but you wouldn't tell me explicitly what it was, because it could happen that I would give a defense for how I translated that word, and it would be fatal for your argument against me. But he's no fool. He's heard the arguments. He's heard the controversy over this particular word. So he says, I think I know which word it is that you think I mistranslated. And so he goes into it. And the word that's being discussed is whether or not it's the word gourd in the Septuagint as a translation of this underlying Hebrew word, or Jerome's translation of it, which was ivy or vine, in this case, ivy from the Dewy Rames. So Jerome translates it ivy. The Septuagint translators translated it gourd. And Augustine says gourd is correct. That's what the Septuagint translators wanted. You've got ivy or vine. This is a bad translation. And a pastor almost lost his job over it. Let's see. Jerome argues. He says, well, here's what happens. I studied the Hebrew. When I look at the Hebrew, when I study its history, the word is ivy or vine. But the word isn't exactly ivy or vine. The exact word, the exact plant is I'm going to probably butcher it, but it's a sicyon. A sicyon. He said, and I could have written sicyon, but nobody would understand what it meant. It would fall on deaf ears. He said, so Sission is close enough to an ivy or vine, and I have support from other Septuagint translations that they also use ivy or vine. And so it's not just one Septuagint translation that says gourd. There are other Septuagint translations that say ivy or vine. So I am at liberty to use ivy or vine because the people know what an ivy or a vine is, but they don't know what a sission is. So I want them to understand the text, and I want to be accurate to the Hebrew. And accurate to the Hebrew means I do ivy or vine for people to understand it. If I put gourd, they'll understand it, but it's not what the Hebrew says. And that was his argument. And I thought that was fantastic because you see that he's on the functional side of the translation, right? He's less of the word for word, so he's doing some interpretation there, but he still cares about accuracy. I don't want to just pick any plant. I want to pick a plant that is represented by this Hebrew word. And gourd, in his opinion, did not represent the Hebrew word. And he could have been perfectly exact and put sission, but then his readers wouldn't know what it was. And the whole purpose of a translation is so that readers understand the text. That's why you're translating it. Otherwise, just give it to them in a language they don't understand and tell them to use a lexicon. So this is a big deal, and I appreciate his carefulness here. And so he is careful to use ivy and vine because it's accurate and because that's what the Hebrew says. Now, what's interesting to me as someone on the outside reading this argument between them and not understanding the cultural context, why is Augustine making such a big deal out of gourd and ivy or vine? And in that, why is he using this particular issue to discredit Jerome's work entirely? He's making this like the hill to die on for Jerome. And so I was like, there's got to be more to this than just the fact that it's a misunderstanding of the word ivy or vine. It's got to be deeper. And so as I began to look, I realized that there was significant importance to the early church with gourds. They had water bottles that they would travel with the pilgrims in the shape of gourds to remind the pilgrim of God's providence and provision, right? In the same way that Jerome needed shade, God provided it. The pilgrims need water. It's in their bottle. It's a reminder for them to remember that God provides for them. What's interesting, Beverly's not here this morning. So I was talking to Beverly last week after the class when we talked about this. And in French, the word for a water bottle or a flask is gourd. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So that Latin word found its way into French in the same way. So that's really cool. They saw that Jonah's story had a plant that rose up and died. And so they said, hey, this is significant. This is typology. This is allegorical interpretation of the plant for Jonah, that this is Christ living and dying. It's about his death. It's about his death. And so they were really emphasizing Christ's death through the gourd. And then what also they did is they did the flip side. They said, well, the gourd sprung up really quick as well. And so it's also not just a representation of his death, that the life that he lived, his incarnation, his life and incarnation and death, it's also representative of his resurrection. And so the gourd was symbolic of his resurrection. So what you see here is you see the apples here, they represent man's fall. Just like we still use the symbology today. We use apples generally, even though we know that's probably not what was in the garden, or we really have no idea what was in the garden. The apple has taken that symbolic spot. So the apple represents man's fall, and the gourd represents man's redemption. And so this was a big deal to the early church. So to change gourd to change the word from gourd to ivy impacted their symbolism. And it would be the same way I suggested last week if we said, the Christian fish is wrong. We got it wrong. It's actually a squid. I don't know. It's actually a squid. You'd be like, no, we've been doing fish forever. Or we would say, and I suggested the Jehovah's Witnesses have already done this, it's not a cross that Jesus died on, it's a stake, no crossbeam on it. And so your symbolism is all wrong. We don't have a cross up. We have a cross right there in the pulpit. Your symbolism's all wrong. And so you could see how this could impact people and make people upset and things of that nature. And so it was important to the early church that this gourd took prominence. Now, today it's not. So today the argument seems like no big deal to us. Why would you make a big deal? Well, if there was some sort of cultural context by which we were recognizing Christianity, you could see how that would be upsetting for a lot of Christians. And so Jerome closes his letter this way, and I really appreciate Jerome's close. So he says this. Let's see. Okay. In closing this letter, I beseech you to have some consideration for a soldier who is now old and has long retired from active service, and not to force him to take the field again and expose his life to the chances of war. Do you, who are young and who have been appointed to the conspicuous seat of pontifical dignity, give yourself to teaching the people and enrich Rome with new stores from fertile Africa. I am contented to make but little noise in an obscure corner of a monastery with one to hear me or to read me. So Jerome had started in Rome when Damasus, his bishop Damasus, encouraged him to start the translation. He moved to Jerusalem, and I believe that's where he stayed. I don't know. I can't remember if he went back to Rome, but he stayed in a monastery. He was done. He was old. Augustine's younger. They're contemporary. Augustine's on the field. He's doing the fighting now. And Jerome says, do the fighting. Keep doing it. Just don't make me enter the field again. I'm old and I'm tired. I've done my job. And he's just kind of being humble with that. And I appreciate Jerome's kind of humbleness there. He says, if you don't like it, then teach people why it's not right. And earlier when he still got some fire in him though, because earlier when he said, hey, if the Septuagint translators found something obscure, they were the best people to interpret it. And if it was plain, there's nothing for you to add to it. And Jerome pushes back and he says, well, we have been having commentators do this all along. And he does a list of different commentators who had worked through Psalms, giving us insight into the Psalms. And he lists them out as authoritative commentaries that people respected. And then he says, Augustine, you've also done a commentary on the book of Psalms. And so either if it was obscure, all of these other guys were in a better position to understand it than you are, being closer to the text. And if it was plain, you have nothing to add to it. They've already handled it. So he throws it back and he says, this is just something that people are going to do. This is an everlasting work. We're going to work with obscure texts. We're going to try our best to clear them up. Sometimes we get new discoveries and that helps us. That helps solidify maybe a particular interpretation. But this is always going to be an ongoing work in Christianity. And so I appreciate Jerome's input on that, because otherwise we're in the same position, right? We get to take obscure texts. We get to look at the arguments throughout church history. We get to say, based on the information we have today, these arguments are the better ones. These arguments are the weaker ones. And if we couldn't do that today, then we would just say, throw up our hands. There's nothing new to learn from the Bible. We could just read the early church fathers. We could just read early translations. There's nothing we can contribute. There's no new information. There's nothing. It's all been done. So I think there's a careful balance here, just from one perspective. I'm always careful if I come up with an interpretation from Scripture and I start looking at commentaries, both contemporary and ancient, and I'm the only person who's come up with that interpretation, I'm very careful to say I am probably the one that's wrong, right? I'm not the first person to come up with this. So I still lean on them. But I do find that as I work through contemporary commentaries and ancient commentaries, both in contemporary and ancient commentaries, there's sometimes disagreement. And when there's disagreement, then I try to work through their arguments based on the information we have, and I come up with a conclusion that I think is reasonable without maybe potentially making the other conclusions unreasonable, but also humbly suggesting I could be wrong, they might be right. And based on the information, here's where I stand. Or here's where I lean. Maybe I'm leaning, maybe I'm not standing, and things of that nature. And so I think Jerome can do the same thing. And he did. He showed that he wasn't the first person to come up with ivy or vine, that there were people before him who also came up with ivy or vine, and he gave that support case. And so I think we ought to be able to do that as well. Let's use that support case. So Augustine's last request to Jerome, his last letter, was send me your copy of the Septuagint. Because I didn't know that this was a Septuagint translation in my hands. I want to see your copy. Let's see, Augustine only seemed to have particular manuscripts in his hand. He had some from the New Testament. He had some from the Old. He definitely had Jonah. He also reiterates in his last letter, he's a stubborn guy. He reiterates in his last letter that the LXX should be given supremacy. And in the case where it could be translated gourd or ivy, if that's truly the case, then go with gourd. Why would you go against the Septuagint translators, despite the fact that Jerome already established that there are other Septuagint translators, because there's more than one manuscript, that did use ivy or vine. And that's that. And so what's interesting, if you open your Bibles today and you go to that passage in Jonah where the ivy springs up, you'll see that translators today are still working on that word. They're still working on that word. Let's go. I'll just fast forward briefly to the Reformation era. The first three major Protestant translations, let's say Coverdale, the Matthew's Bible, and the Great Bible. The first three, they all say either ivy or vine. If you look at the last three major translations, the Geneva, the Bishop's Bible, or the KJV, they all say gourd. And so you can see even within the Protestant tradition, there is some disagreement. So if your translation lands on the side of gourd, they are following Augustine's arguments. If your translation says something on the side of vine or ivy, you are landing in Jerome's camp. Here's the thing. Most of your translations that are in your lap say neither. They say a plant. We're not sure which plant it is. We see the arguments. We're not willing to make a decision. We don't think it's this important for symbology. It's not leaning in that direction. And so they put a plant. And I find that interesting. And sometimes I think translators have to do that. They just have to let you know, we don't know what plant it is, but we do know it's a plant. And it's not as important as to whether or not it's a sicyon, a gourd, or an ivy or vine. That's not the point of the story. You're going to lose the point of the story if you're going to argue over this particular point. It is about God's sovereignty. It is about God's providence. It is about Jonah learning a lesson. It's not about the allegorical interpretation of Christ's rising and dying. Though if you want to make those allegorical interpretations, you can do so just as well with a generic plant as you can with whether or not it's a gourd. And you can use a gourd as a water bottle to remind you of God's providence too. All right, it's not an issue of heresy, which is almost, Augustine doesn't go there, but he is trying to discredit Jerome really hard with this. We're not in that same cultural setting, so I think I can make a little bit more light of it. You guys aren't in an uproar kicking me out as a Sunday school teacher being like, it's gourd, and me having to go to a nearby Jewish community to confirm that you might be right. So there's that. As far as I can tell, Augustine doesn't ever truly change his position. I went back and I started looking through his commentaries. He still continues to put a lot of weight on the Septuagint. But he does do this. He does concede this. And I was kind of clued into this because the KJV translators quote him as saying that multiple translations are good for finding out the meaning of Scripture. And so I was like, but they didn't tell me well, they did tell me where, but their footnote system isn't the same as our footnote system. And so I had to do some work to find out where Augustine actually said this. And so I didn't put the note down. Anyway, if you have a KJV Bible with the preface to the readers, there's a footnote that tells you where he says it. But essentially, where where Augustine concedes is he says that if you can't read the original languages, which he couldn't read Hebrew, Augustine couldn't read Hebrew. If you can't read the original languages, then multiple translations are helpful. And here's where he's kind of giving a nod to Jerome's Latin Vulgate. This is one of many translations that are helpful. He suggests that you can read it in, he calls it Italian. I'm assuming he means Latin. We distinguish between Latin and Italian today, but he calls it Italian. So you can read it in the Italian, you can read it in the Syriac, you can read it in the Greek. And so these are different ways he says that. Because remember, they weren't monolingual people back then. Most of them couldn't read Hebrew, but they could read at least one or two other languages. Well, definitely one, maybe two or three other languages. And so, so Augustine does seem to concede to some extent that Jerome's Vulgate does have some usefulness in it, but he's not making it the sole authority. It's a helpful translation among helpful translations. And I can agree with him. And at that point, we can shake each other's hands. But yeah, he still puts his firm authority in the Septuagint throughout his writings, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. He already told Jerome he had no contention with him in Jerome's New Testament. And so he freely quotes Jerome's New Testament throughout his commentaries, which is where he spends most of his time. In fact, interestingly enough, too, I was talking to a pastor yesterday, and this actually helped me also understand some of Augustine's issues. Augustine, before he got saved, really struggled with the Old Testament, really struggled with the God of the Old Testament. And it was very common in the early church to have allegorical interpretations of the Old Testament. This was kind of the norm of interpreting it. And when Augustine heard these allegorical interpretations, it softened him to the concept of Christianity. And so these allegorical interpretations were very impactful on Jerome coming to Christ. Augustine coming to Christ. And so I could see if maybe something like a gourd was impactful on how you got saved and you found out that gourd is not the right translation and it impacts your salvation story. I could see how someone would get upset about that. And so I'm just trying to get more sympathetic with Augustine here in the situation he's in. So there's that. Now, there's a couple other things that Jerome did that is going to impact us even today. Impacts Reformation era stuff. We're going to cover that later. So I'm going to revisit the Reformation era translation issues that come up. But there are two that still impact us today that are translation issues. Oh, sorry, before I cover that, there's something also very interesting about Jerome's Latin Vulgate. I said he translated the Hebrew for the Old Testament, and that is true. He did. He translated the whole Old Testament from the Hebrew. But remember, he also did a whole Old Testament from the Septuagint as well. He had two translations out. The one that takes hold in the church, the one that sticks, is the Latin Vulgate from the Hebrew. And that becomes called the Latin Vulgate. His Greek version is called Jerome from the Greek. But what is odd about this, and this gets confusing, is when you get to the book of Psalms. When you get to the book of Psalms, for whatever reason, I don't have an answer for this, but for whatever reason, Jerome's Latin Vulgate is not accepted by the churches in Psalms. His Septuagint translation is what ends up in the Latin Vulgate in the Psalms. So you're all Hebrew until you get to Psalms. Then he's translating from Greek, and then you're all Hebrew again. What's fascinating, I didn't know this initially, but I was going through my CSB Bible, and as I was going through, I saw a footnote that you guys probably know this verse very well. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. Okay, the KJV translation is what sticks in my head there. But there was a footnote in dwell, and it says that the footnote says that the dwell in is following the Septuagint, the Symmachus is another Septuagint, the Syriac, the Targums, and the Vulgate, and Jerome. But the Masoretic text reads differently. So you get all of this support for dwell in. And I thought to myself, this is weird. I see the Latin Vulgate on there, and I see Jerome. And so the front of your Bibles oftentimes will have an abbreviate, or front or back, will have an abbreviation list telling you what each abbreviation means. So I went to the front of my Bible and I found the abbreviation list because I wanted to confirm that I was reading Jerome, because it's J-E-R. And I'm like, I assume it's Jerome. It's got to be Jerome. And I went and it's not in the list. I'm like, oh, that's weird. So then I am in contact with the CSB translators. So I send them a message to one of the guys. But I can't sit and wait for him to respond. I got to try to figure this out. And I looked through all my other Bibles, footnotes throughout Psalms, to see if I could find J-E-R, particularly on this verse, to see if I can see maybe a fuller, instead of an abbreviation, maybe the full word. And no one references J-E-R on this verse. I begin to work through it and I realize the story I just told you, that Jerome used, that the church received a Septuagint version of the Latin Vulgate, okay? And the Jerome that's being referenced here, the J-E-R, is his Hebrew translation. So it's actually the opposite. Jerome's translation is usually Jerome from Greek. In this case, it's Jerome from Hebrew in the Psalms. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. The only Bible that picks up on the Masoretic text, from what I could see here, which I thought was fascinating, it's up there. The only Bible, the Masoretic text says, will return to instead. So I will return to the house of the Lord as long as I live, something of that nature. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting reading from the Masoretic text. But because of the way, my understanding is because of the way that the Masoretic text writes it in Hebrew, it's nonsensical. It doesn't fit the grammar, so everyone follows the Septuagint here. However, the Message Bible does pick up on the Masoretic, the Hebrew reading. It says, your beauty and love chase after me every day of my life. I'm back home in the house of God for the rest of my life. And I was like, oh, this to me just kind of emphasizes the point that Eugene Peterson was really going back to the Greek and Hebrew and really working with the Greek and Hebrew to come up with his paraphrase. He was very careful to, in his case, to follow the Masoretic text here. And he gives a translation for that. And I was like, I appreciate that. That was helpful for me to understand how one might follow the Masoretic text if they were going to, in this case. But instead, they follow the Septuagint and the Symmachus. When I talked to the translator, he finally got back to me. His first comment was, I think the CSB footnote here is a little overkill. He says, we're not even departing from the traditional text, and we have all of this support for the traditional text. And I wrote back, and then he explained to me that I was right in my assessment. And I wrote back to him, I don't think it's overkill. I love it, because I wouldn't have gone down this road had I not seen the footnote. I wouldn't have learned this information. So I appreciated the fact that they put it in there. Let's see here. Okay. I was trying to figure out why I was going to the next slide. So Augustine's concern that the Jews had corrupted the text. Remember, that was his argument, that the Jews had corrupted the Masoretic or the Hebrew texts, and the Christians had been keeping and preserving the Septuagint text, and so we should follow that. This argument that, and Jerome pushes back on this argument when he says, well, you went to a Jewish community to check out whether or not I translated it. And according to you, they confirmed that I translated it wrong. Either A, they're a liar, just like you said, which is what you've been saying, that they corrupted the text, or B, they're wrong. There was no place where Jerome could be wrong. Jerome was right. And so they were wrong. They were either wrong because they were happy to mess with you, or they were just unfamiliar with the language. I know what I did was right. He's convinced. But this argument that the Jews had messed with the Hebrew text was not new. This was a belief in the very, very early church. Justin Martyr, who's early second century, he makes the same argument. I'm not going to read, I'll read some of it. Justin Martyr against Trypho. Trypho is a Jewish person that he's debating. He's trying to get Trypho to come to Christ. Scholars today are not 100% certain if Trypho was a real person or a figurative person set up to represent Jewish beliefs. There's good evidence to go both ways. I tend to believe this is probably Justin Martyr writing down an actual debate he actually had with an actual Jewish person, but not transcribing it directly. Okay, I've done that myself. I'm not going to read this for the sake of time because I want to finish the Vulgate today and I'm running out of time. So what I'm just going to do is just summarize what's happening here. Justin Martyr is defending the use of the Septuagint. He also suggests that that the Jewish people had messed with the Hebrew text, and he quotes Psalm 95, which is Psalm 95 in the Septuagint and Psalm 96 in the Hebrew text. So if you try to go search for this in Psalm 95, you won't find it. Go to Psalm 96. Okay, in Psalm 96, did I not put the verse number down? 10. Psalm 96, 10 is where you'll find this argument. And he says that the verse should read like this: Tell ye among the nations, the Lord has reigned from the wood. They have left. Tell among the, they have left. So this is what they actually write. So he says, how it reads in the Septuagint is, tell ye among the nations, the Lord has reigned from the wood being representation of the cross. And he says, see, this is a messianic prophecy that the Lord is reigning from the cross. He's conquered death. All right. And he says, but in the Hebrew, you said, tell ye among the nations that the Lord reigns. Here's the problem. When you go to Psalm 96:10 in your Bibles, you won't find anything about reigning from the wood. It's not there. In fact, we can't find it anywhere. The only place we have record of this verse reading like this is Justin Martyr. We have no manuscripts that read that way. So we conclude that Justin Martyr is the one who's actually got it wrong. And so I say this to just be careful when we're talking about pieces that are missing. The argument today is it was probably a Christian who added it. The Lord reigns from the wood, added it in the text. We believe Justin Martyr was reading a Septuagint. We just don't have any evidence of that Septuagint existing. We don't have it. We can't lean on it. This is the only place it's quoted. And so we want to be careful. He says, essentially, that you've manipulated the text to remove Christ's, the reference to Christ here, that he would reign from the wood. And today we're like, well, no, we think someone added it. And so that can happen. We could have pious people who are trying to put Christ in the Old Testament and make it more clear. And we can do the same thing in the New Testament. So we just want to be careful with how we deal with that. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to mention briefly, and we'll close. There's some translation choices that Jerome made. This is what I was alluding to earlier. Jerome made this particular translation issue. This is Michelangelo's Moses sculpture, and he was influenced by this verse to sculpt it in this way. It says, as Moses descended from the Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of testimony in his hands, as he had descended from the mountain, he did not realize that the skin of his face shone as a result of his speaking with the Lord. There's nothing in this verse that would help you identify what Michelangelo is doing here. But if you read it in the Latin Vulgate, you'll understand what happened. And when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he held the 2 tablets of the testimony, and he knew not that his face was horned from the conversation of the Lord. And so if you look at Moses here, he's got these horns up here. And why does he have horns on his head? Well, because this is a Hebrew idiom that Jerome, probably against his better judgment, translated literally. And so his face shining like horns is the idea of what we use for sun rays. All right, his face had rays on his head, but the Hebrews was horns. All right, and you can see how that works in a cross language, that he had horns on his head. His face was shining with rays. And But Michelangelo took that verse very literally, as one would, and he drew horns on his head, which is quite a different cultural understanding today. If we put horns on someone's head, we think more satanic. So I find that interesting. Another one that's probably actually more theologically discerning is this one. Mary on the plague column. You'll see pictures of Mary like this often. Something of this nature. It says, I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. That is how our translations read today. But in the Latin Vulgate, it reads, I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt wait for her heel. So the fact that it's whether it's Jesus is going to crush the head or Mary is going to crush the head becomes an important issue. We know that this verse translated this way has an impact on Mary's theology throughout the church. So this becomes an important point. However, we cannot find any manuscript that has it in the feminine here. We can't find any other translation of the Bible in Syriac, Coptic, anywhere that translates it in the feminine here. It's only in the Latin Vulgate that it's translated in the feminine. And so that's interesting. So those are impactful on us. And so I want to close with Jerome's words, finally, from his own mouth. It's the preface. He's reading. So I recorded this at the Museum of the Bible. And so it's muffled. It's not clear. You're going to have to really kind of pay attention. But it is an excerpt that this actor is reading from Jerome's preface. And I thought it was really well done. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and I'm going to shut up or listen to it so you can hear it.
You urge me to revise the old Latin version and to sit in judgment on the copies of the scriptures, which are now scattered throughout the whole world. And if they differ from one another, you would have me decide which of them agree with the Greek original. The labor is one of love, but at the same time both perilous and presumptuous. For in judging others, I must be content to be judged by all. And how can I dare to change the language of the world in its old age and carry it back to the early days of its infancy? Every man, learned or unlearned, who takes the volume into his hands and does not like what he reads, will break out immediately in violent language and call me a forger and a profane person for having the audacity to add anything to the ancient books, or to make any changes or corrections to them. What then must I do? The task is beyond me, and yet I dare not decline it. I am a mere unskilled passenger, and I find myself placed in charge of a freighted ship. I have not so much as handled a rowboat on a lake, and now the clouds are black as night and the waves are white with foam. For if our ship drifts into the wished-for haven, I shall be content to be told that the pilotage was poor. But if through my unpolished language we run aground amid the rough cross-currents of language, you may blame my lack of power, but you will at least recognize my good intentions.
All right. I love that. If you guys want a copy of it so you can actually read the subtitles through the muffled noise, I'm happy to send you a copy of it. But I really love his heart in his preface that, hey, I did what I did because you commissioned me to do it. This is beyond me. If I fail, it's my failing, and you're welcome to blame me for it. And so this becomes kind of the standard type of preface we're going to continue to read throughout church history. If you want a decent translation of the Latin Vulgate, this is the Douay-Rheims. This is a Roman Catholic translation of the Latin Vulgate, but the translation itself is pretty good. So if you want to know how the Latin would read and you can't read English, read this. Obviously, this is just if you want to know the Latin Vulgate. It's a translation of a translation. And in Psalms, it's a translation of a translation of a translation. So next week, we're going to tackle the Masoretic text. This is going to be a massive influence on all translations, including ours, to this day. So we'll cover that next week. You all are dismissed. Thank you.